here's Antarctica, okay? And we work on the tops of those mountains, right? That's when you work at here's how beautiful it is to work in these places. When you work at the top of a mountain like that, you're cracking the rocks and you're surrounded by ice in every direction. In the coldest place on one of the coldest places on Earth. When you look inside the rocks, what do you see? You see ancient rivers and streams and lakes in the rock, right? And living in those are the fossils of, fish and sharks and invertebrates. Think about that juxtaposition, that difference between where we are today and what's inside the rocks. That tells you so much about how our planet has changed.
I'd like to start with the discovery that you're most famous for, that ancient fish, Tiktaalik, I guess. I'm sure I pronounced this wrong, but still,
You got it right.
Yeah, okay. And I'd like to start there because, I have a couple of questions about evolution, more broadly how it works, and it would be like a good starting point. So why don't you maybe tell us a little bit about what inspired you to go and look for this ancient fossil fish in the first place, and yeah, basically because I know it was quite a long journey, right? Many years in the making. So yeah, how it kind of it represents one of the great, I guess, transitions in the history of life.
Yeah. So thank you for taking the time to chat. Yeah. So we're for a number of years, ever since graduate school for me, when I was training to be a scientist, I was interested in sort of the great transitions of evolution. How did animals evolve to walk on land, or animals evolve to fly, or new revolutions that change how creatures live on the planet, and sometimes even change the planet itself. And so the transition from fish to land living animal was something that became of great interest to me for a lot of reasons. You think about a fish living in water versus an animal living on land, their worlds are entirely different. The organ systems they need seem to be very different. And so I remember thinking when I was a student that would be a great problem to study because it just seems so impossible if you look at the endpoints. So I was training to be a paleontologist um, at the time, although, since I'm studying quite a bit of developmental biology as well. Um, but when we began it, I was really thinking of, how can we find fossils that can tell us more about this transition from fish to land living animals? So the hunt was on. We were really thinking of myself and my first graduate student, actually, Ted Deschler, who has since become a beloved colleague. We've worked for years together. Um, we were thinking together about, how do we find something new? How do we find something that bridges these gaps? And the thing is, in science, we already had some really good fossils that were telling us about how it happened, but they were bits and pieces. We wanted the whole skeleton. We wanted to really see a whole ecosystem, a place where we can really understand things. So we sort of looked around the world for places that would be optimal to look at, and kind of the idea essentially was to find places in the world that had rocks of the right age and rocks of the right type to hold these fossils. And so we studied the geology pretty hard in terms of trying to understand the age of the rocks around the world and what the best age of rock to look at might be. We thought that working on rocks that formed in ancient rivers and streams and tidal environments, kind of like a delta system that's entering a sea kind of thing, where you have all kinds of a range of ecosystems, swampy ecosystems, river ecosystems, tidal ecosystems, all that stuff, that you might have. And so we kind of looked at the geology of the world, dug out tons of maps, and it became clear that one of the best places to look that was studied by geologists, but never by paleontologists, was up in the Canadian Arctic. And that's when we began the hunt up there. So that's kind of what the motivation was, both in terms of like the kinds of questions we were after, like how did fins evolve into limbs? How did creatures evolve the structures that were necessary to do this? And then how scientifically, how we, the scientific factors that led us to the Arctic. And that's kind of, it took us 6 years, but that's kind of what led to that search.
It's not like um, this fish, it's suddenly thought to itself like, oh, I want to climb on the land and let me like develop some feet or whatever. That's why I want to start with this, because it's more like the job of evolution is to repurpose, right, and to tinker in some kind of profound ways. Maybe if could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you think about the structures, so what's interesting about Tiktaalik, and there are other creatures that are like it that we now know from the fossil record, that these creatures have a mix of features that we would associate with fish on one hand and amphibians on the other. That is, they have arm bones, they have lungs, they have gills, they have necks, they have, they have a lot of features that, would be useful in this transitional environment. Now, what's interesting here, and I think that would surprise many people, is that many of the features that were necessary for creatures to evolve to live on land actually originally arose in some version in fish living in aquatic ecosystems. So fish living in aquatic ecosystems, walking on the water bottom, they developed lungs, they developed arms with wrists and ankles. They developed mobile heads relative to the body, mobile necks. They developed a lot of features while living in water that were later useful for living on land. And I think that's a very important point, because many people would think naively, really, that, and it seems obvious actually, that, lungs would evolve as creatures evolved to walk on land. Seems reasonable, right? But the reality is that that's not how it works. Fish evolved lungs to live in aquatic ecosystems well before their descendants evolved to live on land. And they evolved the lungs to live in water, that water that where the concentration of oxygen gets low. They have an accessory organ, a lung, that allows them to breathe when the gills just won't work as well. And so, to get to your question precisely, a lot of evolution really isn't always about the origin of a new structure or the origin of a new gene or the origin of a new developmental system. It's repurposing it, modifying it in a new place, in a new way, or using it for a new function. It's using the old to make the new. And in some cases, that involves using the old structure for a whole new function different than the one it originally arose for. In fact, a lot of evolution is for that. And I think that's a general point that's incredibly important, because the more you look at that, the more you see that's actually happened quite a bit. And many of these revolutions in the history of life didn't always involve new structures per se. They're using old structures in new ways. And then they modify, in that way.
And so, if you, for example, had the chance to talk to Charles Darwin, right, the father of evolution, and do you think that Darwin, if you had given him like all this information about your discovery, do you think what would have been like his reaction to that? In his writing, did like he have anything to say about like that particular transition, or no? What would you
Here's
say that,
what's remarkable.
Yeah.
Darwin actually did comment a little bit on this. And he set the stage for it in a very big way. That is, one of the criticisms that Darwin had in his original edition of The Origin of Species in 1859 came from an anatomist, a scientist, an anatomist, a natural philosopher, St. George Charles Mivart. And Mivart was an anatomist. And he said, he had a very hard time. He criticized Darwin very sharply for, how could structures evolve gradually when the intermediate stages don't seem useful. And he used as an example for this wings, what uses half a wing. But he really kind of suggested that, that the earliest stages in the evolution of a structure are insignificant. They're incipient. They're not able to evolve. And Darwin, in responding to him, so Darwin in the 6th edition of the origin of species. This now is in 1872, 13 years after the first edition, responded to Mavart by saying, well, not only is half a wing better than no wing at all, so he argued for gradualism, but he said one of the big changes here would be using the same structure in a new function. That is, changes in function are important. And is that little phrase, changes in function, which really kind of explains so much a century later in genetics and biochemistry and development and paleontology. So if I was to lay Tiktaalik rosea in front of Charles Darwin, I'd like to think he'd say, oh, that's beautiful and it's great, but it doesn't surprise me at all. You're seeing change of function being very important, and plus it's it has a lot of intermediates. And so, now there are certain surprising things about it, I should say, but as an overview, but those are details. As an overview, it's kind of what Darwin probably would have suspected, to be quite honest.
The discovery itself of yours, it happened in 2004, and since then, have there been like new findings like this, of this particular,
yep, lots
fish, and
there's been a lot that's happened since 2004. Number one, we have like 20 specimens of Tiktaalik. It's not rare. It's not just one critter, like you get online, you type Tiktaalik image and you see that one type specimen, but we have others that are just as good, and they vary in size. There's some that are relatively smaller, some that are much bigger. So you seem to have a growth series of Tiktaalik and a number of different specimens. And we now have both the front end and much of the back end, except for the tail. We still don't know what the tail looked like in that critter. But what's interesting as well, and also very exciting, is that since the discovery of Tiktaalik, other creatures have been described that are very close to it as well. There's one from Quebec known as Elpistostege, which is a very well-preserved creature, very complete, actually. There's a creature from Eastern Europe known as Panderichthys, which is a really fabulously preserved one as well. And I'd anticipate if, you come back in 5 to 10 years, there'll be more of this group. This is a pretty big, I'm imagining, and successful group of critters in the tree of life. So I think as more colleagues do field work, they're going to find more of these things.
When you think of the great transitions in the history of life on this planet, I'm sure like there's still like plenty of mysteries, but maybe there are some that are like of particular interest to you. Maybe
lots, yeah. It's a whole universe of really great questions to explore scientifically that are out there. There's still many things we don't know about the transition from life in water to life on land. Tiktaalik doesn't answer every question. In fact, there are a lot of great ones out there, and that's what keeps us in business. Honestly, the transition I think that could use the most work from the paleontological viewpoint and developmental one is the origin of vertebrates themselves, the origin of fish themselves from worm-like creatures. We do have very big gaps in our fossil record there. And I think, there are rocks around the world that should produce good fossils. I think, there's a lot of mysteries there that I think can be solved by people really concentrating on finding fossils at the right time period for that, kind of like what we do with Tiktaalik. And in fact, we're doing a little bit of that ourselves. We're just starting that out. It means looking at much older rocks. But, there are lots of great puzzles out there for us to study scientifically. And the origin of vertebrates would strike me as a great one because we have a big gap in the fossil record. And I think because we know they arose as soft-bodied creatures, but then skeletonized ones don't appear till much later, like 40, 50, 60 million years later in the fossil record. And so there's a big gap there. And it would be very interesting to fill that gap with fossils. And I think, dedicated field work certainly would do it. But it would take years of work. It's not just something you're going to go out, crack a rock, and find it in the first day. It took us 6 years to find Tiktaalik. I think it would easily that to find an early vertebrate, but a new place with early vertebrate.
And the origin of life is itself it's a big one. And from what I know, Darwin himself he commented on this a bit, right? Like how life itself might have come about. Do you think that I know it's like very big question in of itself, but do you think that maybe in your lifetime will be able to like pinpoint, or here is like where life
Yes.
began, or yeah.
Oh, in a word, yes. Honestly, I think, what would go a long way on that one would be using AI and a knowledge of physical chemistry and a detailed knowledge of the early Earth to really think about what in detail are the kinds of conditions that led to the origin of replicating molecules in a cellular system and being able to replicate that in a laboratory over time. And if you could show, using experimental techniques, kind of like what Urey and Miller did to find the production of amino acids. They did this actually in the 50s. But if you did that with more complex macromolecules to get a replicating molecule in the lab, if you can show that you can get that under the right conditions, I think that would go a long way towards our understanding of the origin of life. And I do think, that's something that will happen eventually. The other thing could happen eventually is people discover the signature of metabolic life, metabolic systems, or reproducing systems on Mars, or Enceladus, or Europa, or any of these other, the moons of Saturn or Jupiter or Mars, which may have held life or hold life still. So I think we're just beginning that study there. But I do think there are empirical, experimental, and theoretical ways to approach this. And I can think of the kinds of experiments that would show the likely possibilities for the origin of life 4 billion years ago. But one thing we do know is life arose pretty early. Probably arose around 4 billion years ago, and the Earth is about 4.57 billion years. So pretty quick in the scheme of things in the history of the planet.
Yeah, like almost as soon as the conditions allowed it, right,
Right.
to appear. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And boom, you have it. And then you might have had it several times too. It might have been you had the right conditions, and you had several different things we would have called, in retrospect, called life, and maybe only one of them took root. But I'm thinking you probably had the right conditions in sort of a cauldron where you had different versions of things we'd call living systems coming about over a period of time. And to me, what that shows is, once you have the right conditions, evolving macromolecules and even protocellular systems can spontaneously happen, and I think that's kind of incumbent on colleagues who are interested in this to demonstrate that in the laboratory, and then to tie that back geochemically to the early Earth systems.
And but do you feel like life um, like almost has to evolve in this like manner that we've been like observing on this planet, or do you think maybe there's other ways that life could develop that would be like totally different to the one that we have, like,
Oh,
not like DNA or even RNA based, just
yeah. I mean, look, if anything that's possible almost certainly has happened, right? If it's a physical possibility, physical and chemical possibility, it's probably happened somewhere in the universe. I think that's kind of my speculation. Just because there are so many different kinds of planets, there are so many, different kinds of planets, shapes, sizes, distances from stars, and so forth, that I'm thinking that almost anything conceivable could happen. And so, yeah, and some of that probably stretches our imaginations to some extent about and definitions about what a living system is. I mean, it's pretty hard to define what life is, to be quite honest, because it depends, right? And so, and I think that may be a reflection of reality, to be quite honest.
and
Like viruses, are they living systems?
yeah,
Are they not
exactly.
living systems?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
I think you'll be pleased to know that two of your books have been translated into Ukrainian. From what I have seen, like you're in a fish. I guess it was the first one, right? Popular Science
Yeah,
book
that was the
that you,
first one.
yeah,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and some assembly required also.
Right.
And I know that like you come up with this most recent book, Ends of the Earth, but yeah, it just came
Behind
out
me.
this year. Yeah, and.
Yeah.
Hopefully it will end up in Ukrainian as well. But I mentioned all this maybe like for the listeners, if anyone wants to like check out some books related to the subjects, like to evolution or whatever, like some popular science, what would you recommend? You can mention your own, obviously, books, or I have immensely enjoyed your writing, obviously, and also like love what Dawkins has written on evolution.
Yeah, I
Obviously,
think
yeah,
there are a lot of great books out there. We have some really great books. And so I think, first is Sean B. Carroll, the biologist Carroll. Endless Forms Most Beautiful is one of my favorite books. It's about the developmental evolutionary biology. I think it's really a wonderful book. He's written a number of books. Just point, you go to any of the books that Sean Carroll has written. It's
yeah.
really
I had
fabulous.
him on the podcast now. Yeah,
Yeah,
yes, yeah.
and for good reason. His books are great. Dawkins, obviously, one of my two books I think that I really like of Dawkins's are The Blind Watchmaker, which talks about natural selection, and Ancestor's Tale, which is a clever way he's told the history of life on Earth, going from the recent back. I thought was really, really clever that way. In terms of paleontology, there are a lot of really good ones, the really great authors out there. Richard Fortey has written a book called Life. It's a really fabulous book. Steve Brusati, Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs. Um, Other Worlds by Halliday, which is a really good one. Yeah, there's some really great books out there. So no lack of great books and authors. And scientist authors, which is really great to have scientists who talk about their work. So Inner Fish, my first book, was really about how in every gene and every cell and every tissue and every part of our bodies, we have the history of life inside of us. And so what I did in that book was to take apart the history of our branch of the tree of life in our cells, in our DNA, in our bodies, using fossils and DNA and so forth. And then, honestly, while I was writing Inner Fish, I had the idea for Some Assembly Required. And it really was about how, when we think about these great transitions in evolution, like the ones I was talking about with water to land, you can go out and find fossils, like I said, with Tiktaalik, you can go out and find fossils that tell us about how this happened. But the reality is when we look at what's happened in biology for the last, say, 50 years, it's been a revolution in our thinking of genes and development and tissues and tissue systems and physiology. It's really been a revolution in our thinking about the genetic and developmental underpinnings of many of the changes we see. And some of those discoveries have been really profound, like the discovery which Sean Carroll describes of sort of an essential toolkit, genetic toolkit, which underlies the formation of different body plans. And um, and so really it was thinking about that as my own evolution from as a paleontologist to somebody who works on molecular biology and genetics. I'm still doing paleontology, but I just added that other toolkit in, and how that multidisciplinary approach of thinking about fossils, of thinking about genes, of thinking about developmental systems really empowers us to explore these great events in the history of life, not just our connection to the rest of life on our planet, which is what I talked about in Inner Fish, but really the mechanisms by which these big changes happen. And sort of it was really fun writing that book because it was taking me back to some of my own roots and some of my own interests. But importantly, it was also taking me to some of the great historical moments in the field itself in the last century and a half. And telling those stories, the way I like to write is to tell the stories through the stories of working scientists. Every now and then it's myself, but mostly it's other people. And I love, talking about their work and what inspired them and what set them back and what the challenges they faced and all that good stuff.
Yeah, but it's amazing to me because you described that, like again, like you mentioned Sean Carroll, and I guess from what I remember, he said that all those like discoveries came from essentially like studying fruit flies, right? And it's amazing because those like very same genes, right, are in us and in virtually every like animal
Oh,
and
gosh.
plant. Yeah.
Yeah. When I was studying as a graduate student, this is in like the early mid 1980s, there were these papers that were scientific papers coming out showing the number of genes that were involved in building the body of flies. These are genes that controlled, where antennae appear, where legs appear, wings, and so forth. And not only was it showing those genes in flies, but it was showing that other creatures had versions of those same genes too, whether they're frogs or worms or fish or mice or people. And those genes are also building the basic body plan of those creatures as well. So it was like, there was a very exciting time in science because it was really showing deeply how sort of the genetic underpinnings of different structures and creatures as different as flies and humans are very similar in some ways. There's a commonality to that. And that was exciting because what it did is it offered scientists from a variety of different stripes the ability to now ask questions about, okay, what are the developmental differences between, say, a salamander and a fish, and how could they likely evolve? And what we find is that oftentimes it's using similar genes in new ways. Now, there are lots of new genes that appear, tons, but a big part of it is actually using old genes in new ways, kind of like what Darwin said in terms of change in function, you know, uh, over a century and a half ago. And so, yeah, that was really exciting. And so part of that was also some assembler required in my own book, because that really informed my own evolution as a scientist, where I realized, wow, I'm studying the great transitions in the history of life by trying to find fossils around the world, but you can also do it by looking at the fundamental biology of creatures that are alive today.
But do you think maybe again, like a very big question, we're still like living in the Darwinian paradigm, or like have we moved maybe to something else? Like now that we have learned so much more, since his death. Do you think? Yeah, basically, what kind of role his ideas like still play, in our like understanding of life? If you can maybe.
Oh, his ideas are still very important. The relationship between common descent, that there's a tree of life, and natural selection. That was his central thesis. Now, other people had talked about both in different ways, but he pulled them both together in a real cogent framework, which, by the way, Alfred Russel Wallace, more or less at the same time, had the same idea. But, essentially those two, Wallace and Darwin. Um, but, when we look at the evolutionary biology we talk about today, I mean, it is different in some ways. While there are large similarities when we talk about natural selection and common descent and these sorts of things, while there's a commonality with Darwin, there are differences as well. And so Darwin was a very strict gradualist. He saw gradual change and slow change as being kind of it. And the reality is, we now know that change can happen rapidly. We call it catastrophically. One great example of that is some of the large extinctions in the history of life. They weren't gradual affairs. They were quite intense, quite rapid, and global. And so they didn't quite fit the Darwinian. They don't quite fit the Darwinian paradigm. I mean, other things too. But as far as forming a template for 150 years of research that follows, I mean, the origin of species is pretty darn good. But as it is, it's a product of its time. One of the things about Darwin, that we forget is he wrote the book, The Origin of Species, before we knew much anything about genetics, right? And pretty bold to do, because not knowing much about genetics, he could easily have been wrong. But it's really the science of genetics, when that came in from Mendel and the statistical geneticists and population geneticists, and then later molecular genetics. That's really been, the powerful combination in many ways that is behind the enduring nature of the Darwinian approach.
But yeah, I also find it fascinating that, like you mentioned, this mass extinctions, like how much you can learn from just looking at those rocks, right? For example, you see those layers, and like some of those layers, they maybe like centimeter wide like layers, right? And you can like see like some of them mark like dramatic changes in the history of life, right? You can learn so much from just those rocks. Yeah.
Oh, trust me, I love that. I mean, the fact that it takes me here. Think about this. here's Antarctica, okay? And we work on the tops of those mountains, right? That's when you work at here's how beautiful it is to work in these places. When you work at the top of a mountain like that, you're cracking the rocks and you're surrounded by ice in every direction, in the coldest place on one of the coldest places on earth. When you look inside the rocks, what do you see? You see ancient rivers and streams and lakes in the rock, right? And living in those are the fossils of, fish and sharks and invertebrates. Think about that juxtaposition, that difference between where we are today and what's inside the rocks. That tells you so much about how our planet has changed, in the course of evolutionary time. And then, it's those things that the rocks tell you, which I think are really powerful, and they're very beautiful and very surprising in some ways.
Or we can just, for example, look up at the moon at night, right? And we can also see like those like craters and so on, that are caused by those like impacts. And so yeah, we can like with our planet, it's a bit different because we've got a lot of water, right? So we can see these craters too easily, but still um, yeah,
Also, we play tectonics, right?
yeah,
So
plate tectonics,
the
yeah,
crust is always changing. So
yeah,
old asteroid impacts are probably
yeah.
wiped away. Many of them are wiped away.
Yeah. But I love that, like, yeah, this wrecks, they preserve like so much of our history, So uh,
Oh yeah, it's amazing.
like nothing else, yeah. But as a Ukrainian, and I try to ask this like all of my guests, because I speak to like this very smart and wise people, and I think like from like studying science and being immersed in this world, like there's a certain perspective that like comes with it, like the way you look at life and approach things. I'll share like a few words of wisdom, if that's okay. Just
Words of wisdom.
yeah,
Yeah.
just want to.
Um, I guess the biggest word of wisdom I see, when I look at the history of life and when we think about fossils and DNA, is that, as we discover cures and discover new tools to understand our world, that work is originally based on some of the most simple creatures on our planet, that fruit flies, worms, and others contain stories that are very important for us. And so I like to think that as we discover cures to everything that ails us, from Alzheimer's to different cancers, that the breakthroughs that will extend and enrich our lives are in some way based on flies, worms, fish, and other creatures. And that's a very powerful statement about the connection of all life on our planet, how we are all deeply connected, not only to other living things, other species, but we are in some very important ways connected to one another. That changes that are happening in one place affect people affecting everywhere else. So I think the key thing to keep in mind is that we're all deeply connected and you're never truly alone. So right now, I'm sort of what's called the nominee for president of the National Academy, and there's like a ratification election that happens next month. And if all goes as planned, I'll be assuming the presidency in July. And the reason why I'm doing it is because the way I see science is science itself is a very optimistic enterprise. Nobody starts a field expedition saying, "Oh, I'm not going to find anything." No, you find it because you believe it's going to work, and that's you stuck. We stuck to Tiktaalik because we believed the expeditions in the search of Tiktaalik because we believed it was going to work in the face of all odds. Okay, I mean, it was 6 years of freezing in places like this. Um, but nobody begins an experiment saying, "Oh, I'm not going to learn anything by this." And it's an So science, the act of doing science, is fundamentally optimistic. Now, events may conspire to make the world really rough around you, and we go, really challenging in very profound and fundamental ways. But the course of science itself is an upward trajectory of discovery and learning and betterment of human condition. I mean, it is the ticket to our own health in so many ways, scientifically understanding our bodies, our communities, our minds. And, you know, I'm very optimistic in the long haul about science. I mean, science will not stop. Science is only going to increase over time. And so, yes, there are going to be rough patches in the world around us. But over time, when we look at the history of humanity and we look at the power of the human brain to discover and invent, um, that is a very powerful thing. And I want to make sure that we set the table, we set the stage right for our children and our children's children to have a robust enterprise of discovery and learning, where they too can contribute to understanding our world and making it a better place for everybody. And that's fundamentally what the end point of science can be if it's done right. So that's kind of where I want to be.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. And when you, for example, now think of all the things that you've done in your life, what would you say has given you maybe like the greatest feeling of happiness? If you maybe that moment when you like discovered Tiktaalik, or of all the things, maybe if you can, yeah.
There are so many rewards in a scientific life, it's hard for me to find one. Yeah, the moment where we saw Tiktaalik for the first time, that was a really good moment. But, seeing students and postdocs, seeing the people who've been in my lab or ones I've collaborated with do well, that's actually a big moment too. Um, or seeing something that somebody else discovered that really changes the way you think. That's a beautiful thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be my own discovery. Um, or, the thing for me that has been really important in my own scientific career is being interdisciplinary. That is seeing a problem that, say, well, one field, i.e. paleontology, can help solve that, but having to learn in other fields that you can begin to take that information, whether it's from genetics or development or biomechanics or what have you, to feed into the fossils. And so sort of in learning new fields and new things, I mean, the continual learning about it. So yes, there's the discoveries that my team I have made. There are the discoveries that others have made, and they're flourishing as scientists. And then there's the continual learning, which is itself a joy. It's a life of learning and always kind of trying new things, and mostly failing, by the way. No experiment works the first time. No field trip, at least for us, has worked the first time. But kind of sticking with it and looking at things in a long term, not short term. That's paid off for us, and that's paid off for me and my colleagues. And I think there's something to that.
Um, I don't know, maybe like such a silly question to ask, but about advice. For example, if you were to give advice to a young person, today on how to make their way, in this world, how to maybe like if they dream of like doing something really big, like what you've done, how to try and like approach that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me for when I think about my own career and advising students is really immerse yourself in the great thinkers of the field, as because the natural philosophers of the 1800s and early parts of the 19th 20th century really put their fingers on very important problems. So immerse yourself in the literature and see where people think, but don't let that constrain you. That should give you good ideas. The classic questions are often the best ones. Um, and then be fearless as much as possible about learning the tools necessary to answer the big questions. So break it down into two things. Read the classics and try to understand what the great questions are. Then try to break those great questions down into meaningful things that you can do. Be fearless in terms of learning the tools that are necessary to answer those questions. You can tether those two things, coming up with the great questions and the tools to answer them, you're doing incredibly well. It's something I aspire to do. I don't always do it well, but that's something I definitely aspire to do.
And well, maybe just as a final question, do you have like any big project in mind that you'd love to pursue?
Research-wise, on the origin of vertebrates, we talked about this earlier in our conversation. This gap in the record between worm-like creatures and creatures with skeletons. To me, that's a number one A+ scientific question with lots of puzzles. We don't know a lot, and I think some targeted local field work might be able to help us there. And so I do see myself doing that over the coming year. It may be on the side, in the hours that are outside my normal working hours, but we'll definitely do it. Right now, I'm teaching college students. I don't teach until next year. um, starting in 2026. But I will be teaching undergraduates, college students. I teach a course on Your Inner Fish, my first book, about the human anatomy and how it's evolved over, deep time, long periods of time. Our connections to the rest of life on our planet. That's the story of that class.
I guess it's like a virtual background that you're using, right? It's like,
Oh, this is a background from where I worked in
yeah.
2019.
So yeah.
So this is one of our field sites. Yeah, it's one of our field sites.
So yeah.
That's Antarctica. It's about 600 miles from the South Pole, and the field sites are here and in some of these mountains in the distance. It's where we work. Yeah, our
Yeah.
camp, you can't really see it. It's just underneath this hill here. It would have been. You'd see our tents if I was to show that.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. Like I said, I've been a huge fan of your, work of your writing and have, wanted to do this for quite some time. But I'm very glad, it's finally worked out. So thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm really glad it worked out, and
Yeah,
thank you for making the time. I
yeah.
appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, and best of luck, in your work and in your new position. Hopefully, if all goes well, right? As like president, I'm sure like there's lots of work, but you will handle this well. Yeah, so thank you.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to it,
Yeah.
and thank you so much. And I look forward to working with Ukrainian scientists in the context of being
Ah,
national. We have programs. National Academy has programs with
okay.
Ukrainian scientists, particularly in physics and math. So I look forward to continuing those collaborations and wish sending you and Ukrainian students and scientists the best.